Greetings, friends and fellow freelancers. Welcome back to another episode of Tabletop Mercenary. Though you all are seeing this in the vaunted year of 2025, there are still a dozen hours left in 2024 at time of recording. So I would like to invite everyone to please step into the past with me as I tell you all a story that I was related over the holiday. Because this is something that, while it does not happen often, it is a tale of epic failure, which I believe that anyone who's planning on getting into RPGs as a creator who wants to do this as a profession should hear, because this is not how things are done. And at the end of the story, I will wrap it up with some of the myths that we tend to believe and why certain people will end up making these mistakes. But before we go on, names have been changed to protect the innocent. If you think you know who the story is about, please don't share the details down in the comments. We want to learn from this experience, maybe have a bit of laughs, but we don't want to embarrass anyone by name. Now, the way this story goes is the friend who told this to me had a partner several years ago when they were still in college, and their partner and some of their friends had gotten together and they had formed a gaming company. They wanted to publish games, they wanted to get out there and really put their ideas on the market, and it was an endeavor they were very much involved in. They wanted to support their partner, they wanted to make sure that they got to live their dream, their business was very successful. However, when they actually got a look behind the scenes, they realized things were not going the way they thought they were going. And as with many such horrendous breakups and shattering of illusions, this happened at Gen Con. Now, what had happened is, leading up to Gen Con, he and his friends who had formed a gaming company decided they were going to go to Gen Con, they were going to bring their game, and they were going to show it to the public. Perfectly normal. That happens every single year it goes on, and a lot of folks actually achieve a lot of success doing that. So they got together, they got down to Indianapolis, they all combined forces, and when this person telling me the story got there, they realized that this little cadre of gentlemen had no clue what the hell they were doing. So, to begin at the top, they had paid for a booth in the nosebleed section of the convention. For those who have never been to Gen Con, it is massive. Now, people who are starting off gaming companies, who are amateur game designers, there's no way they can afford the price tag to get something up front. That's perfectly normal. Those spaces go to places like the former White Wolf, Ronix Path, they go to Wizards of the Coast, they go to Paizo, game companies with really big budgets, lots of product to sell, and that people are going to probably know before they even come to the convention. You get into the middle section where you have to walk in a little ways. That's where you find Artist Alley. That's where you find all the independent authors. It's where you find lots of folks who trade, cards and card games, things like that. You get into the section where these gentlemen had paid for, and yes, those booths are cheaper. They are more affordable, particularly for first-timers, for smaller game companies. But the reason they're so affordable is that a large portion of the convention never bothers going that far back. This is where you hear the constant drip of water and where the cheers of the con come muted through the air because there's that much space between you and the actual action going on at the front of the hall. But that is not a problem in and of itself. That is probably a smart business move for those who are just starting out, who are testing the waters, who don't have a lot of experience, don't have a lot of pull to bring customers in. Sure, that's not the issue. The next thing they notice is that these individuals don't have a booth, which is not to say they don't have a space. They have the space they rented. What they don't have are any of the accoutrement that comes with showing a game at a con. They don't have tables, they don't have tablecloths, they don't have signage, they don't have speakers to play music, they don't have any sort of screens demoing their game, they don't have lights, sounds, they don't have anything engaging to get people to step off the path into their booth. They don't even have racks to display the game they brought. And for folks who are paying close attention to the story, you heard that correctly, game, not games. Most people, when they come to Gen Con, will kind of make that their capstone of, They've put out several games, they have a lot of material, they have enough stuff they feel that they could probably make up the cost of doing this event. Even a small booth of the size that they have chosen to get for this event probably costs several hundred to well over $1,000 on the dealer floor. Making back that much money at a convention, in addition to hotel costs, in addition to food, in addition to travel, in addition to all of those other expenses, is an astronomically difficult thing to do. So, not only did they get a booth way in the back where nobody is going to just stumble upon them, not only did they not bring anything to make themselves stand out from the competition, to make them noticeable, they only brought a single game. And, theoretically, this could be the turnaround point of the story. This could be the point where it turns out the one game that they brought was so amazing that everyone who came across it ignored their lack of signage, ignored their lack of preparation, and just thought, this is the greatest thing that I have found this year at Gen Con, bar none. That is not what happened, because their game was essentially a palette swap of, well, another very popular card game out there. For folks watching this, you may not have played this. It's been out of print for a while, as I understand it, but there's a card game called Illuminati. The general idea behind Illuminati is each of you take on the role of a particular faction who's trying to take over the world. You know, whether it be the Church of the Subgenius, or whether it be the New World Order, or whoever it is. And each of you plays cards to create various splinter groups and various public interests that you control. And as the game goes on, you attempt to take interests away from fellow Illuminati so that you are the dominant force who decides what goes on in the world. It's a fun game. It's a little on the complicated side. And mechanically speaking, it's not a terrible thing to try and rip off. However, the game that they presented, and I say this with as much gentle criticism as I can, having been shown pictures of it by the person who was telling me this story, was it was not a good ripoff. The cards had simple geometric designs on them, but they didn't have any text. This made them hard to interpret and hard to understand, and they didn't really have any kind of evocative style or genre that went with them. The problem was this was supposed to be a cyberpunk game. The idea was not that you were megacorporations, but that you were each hackers attempting to take over different parts of the net from each other. Which as a concept is fun. They could have made that work, but there just was not enough there. They needed a lot of refinement. They probably needed a new direction in their art. They needed at least a couple more redesigns of this game before it was really ready for public consumption. But all of those problems are things that happen. These are mistakes that a lot of us have made and that a lot of us have learned from. This is where we get to the kicker, because the person telling me this story was befuddled. Their partners sounded like they knew what they were talking about. The people they were forming this company sounded like they knew what they were talking about. They couldn't figure out how someone with all this good sense, with all of this research, all this experience, who had in fact made a game, could stumble this badly. And so they asked them, what were you all planning to do? What was your goal? Because on top of all these other things that I've already mentioned, they only brought about 50 copies of this card game with them, ready for sale. I do not want to disclose the numbers, because again, that could give away some factors, but doing the math, even if they sold every single copy of the game that they brought, that wouldn't even be enough to even out their booth fee, much less all the other expenses they had incurred doing this convention. That seemed utterly nonsensical. So, this person sat their partner and their partner's friends down and demanded to know what the hell it is they thought they were doing. Their answer, with utter confidence, was that they were certain someone from Paizo, from Wizards of the Coast, from one of the other major gaming companies, while trawling the rows, while going through all of the other games that were available and that they could check out while they were at this con, would see their game, would decide this is the next big thing, and make them an offer on it, and they would then sell the rights to that game to the much bigger company. I will pause for those of you out there who are guffawing with laughter and possibly falling out of your chairs, because this does not happen. Period. This is an unfortunate myth that a lot of us believe in the publishing industry in general, as well as in entertainment in general. This is a prime example of the being discovered myth. We see it perpetuated throughout almost all of our pop culture. We hear about it in interviews, we see it in newspapers, and a lot of us assume that's actually the way a majority of people get into an industry. They get famous, they get discovered. Which is to say, for those of you who have not heard the term before, I'm not sure how you got to this corner of YouTube, but if you have not heard the term before, the idea of getting discovered is that someone who is already established, whether it's a company, whether it's a record label, whether it's a publisher, whether it's just a famous celebrity in the same field you're in, sees you, sees your work, and decides that you are the next raw talent that they are going to take and they are going to mold into something important. That is going to be your meal ticket. And that may have happened a dozen times in the history of the industry. That is not how things happen. That is not how you become a game designer. That is not how you become established in the industry. If that happens, it is a fluke chance. It is one of those 1 in a million stories, and it's one reason that we tell that story over and over and over again, because it is so rare. Now, do publishers go around and try to find smaller indie creators and indie products and then try to snap up the rights to them so that they can get on that gravy train and make the money? That absolutely happens. That happens every day. However, the parameters for what decides why and when that happens are the things that these individuals didn't seem to grasp. Because when publishers make those decisions, they do not make them based on quality of artistic vision, based on quality of product. Those are not things they care about. These are businesses. Businesses do not care about art. This is a point that I have made repeatedly throughout this series, but maybe not quite in such a dramatic turn of phrase. But you, as far as businesses are concerned, create a product. They care about that product having name brand recognition, they care about it having a built-in audience, and they care about it selling. This is a thing we see in other parts of the publishing industry that also applies to gaming, because you saw several years ago, for those who had their ear to the ground and were paying attention, lots of independent authors, lots of authors that were self-published that had found an audience, that were making sales, that had already proven they had talent, they had an audience, they could sell copies of books, were the ones getting offers from AAA publishers, from the big publishers in the industry. Because those publishers saw this person had already run the gauntlet of public opinion, they had already done the seemingly impossible of they had found themselves an audience. They had succeeded already. The publishers wanted a sure thing. They wanted to know that if they gave this person a contract, they already had tens of thousands of fans who would show up and buy copies of their books. And that was what the folks in this story didn't seem to understand. When this happens, it's not because an editor reads a copy of a book published independently and they think, wow, this person is really talented. We should get a hold of them as soon as possible. What happens is that a businessman is watching the news and he sees the numbers and he hears this romance author sold enough, copies to pay for her husband's chemo, or this guy wrote enough horror books that he bought himself a house in the 2020 market. And they think, wow, those people are doing numbers. We need to get in on that before the wave crashes. And that is what could have made that story have a happy ending of if they had published their game, which they technically did, if they had established it as an up-and-coming game in the industry, if it had an audience, that would have gotten attention from bigger publishers. If they had a fan base, if they were doing lots of demos, if they were doing numbers, that would have gotten publishers' attention. But at the end of the day, they were an indie game studio that showed up with an untested game to a public that didn't know who they were and had no clue what their game was supposed to be about, with a game that at the end of the day hadn't really passed a market test. They hadn't taken it to smaller game stores. They hadn't taken it to smaller conventions. They hadn't gotten any feedback. This was the debut of their first ever game. And it was only through the very clever and very deliberate marketing efforts of the person telling me this story that they moved even half of the games they had brought with them. Because left to their own devices, these folks would have been standing there in an empty booth with no name recognition, a product nobody had ever heard of, and just watching people walk by in the aisle, waiting for them to step into their booth and ask them, is something wrong? Because they didn't have anything with them. They didn't even have branded shirts to let folks know who they were, what game company they represented, and what they were trying to do here. So, if you take away nothing else from this story, and if you go into the new year with no other pieces of advice, keep this in the forefront of your mind. It takes years of work sometimes to become an overnight success. When you hear stories about people getting discovered and games shooting to the top of the sales rack, if you hear people going on about how their new book was a bestseller, ask how long it took them to get there. How much work did they have to do to build the base to step up to where they are now? Because while there are fluke incidents, there are random pieces of luck that can make or break someone's fortune, a lot of the time, if you look into the background, you'll notice this is a person who's been working for years making various different products. You'll notice a person who has made dozens of different games, who has worked with a variety of companies. You'll notice that there are people who have all of the experience, have made all of the connections, so that when the opportunity arose for them to step into the spotlight for a moment, they had done all of the work. It's the equivalent of seeing someone who becomes, the hot new ingenue on stage. That didn't just randomly happen to somebody in the audience who thought, I'm going to get up there and give it a shot. It was years of work and dedication and figuring out what needed to be done so that when the opportunity came their way, they were ready to go. So, remember that rags to riches stories are not real most of the time. If you want to become a game designer, start small, be deliberate, research what you're doing, and talk to other people in the industry. Ask questions, find out if what you're hoping to achieve is realistic, if it's even possible, or if you're going in with expectations that are not going to match the reality. Because, sad to say, a lot of folks have a very pop culture idea of what it's like to be a success, whether it's as a singer, as an author, as a game designer. We have all of these myths. And if we try to follow the myths, we oftentimes cannot repeat that success in the real world. But that doesn't mean you can't get there if you take deliberate steps, if you're sure of what you're doing, and if you actually follow the numbers and don't risk it all on one hopeful play. But that's the advice I would like folks to go into the new year with. Hopefully 2025 is treating all of you well by the time you all see this. And if you have any questions about other myths that can trip folks up in the industry, can really be a problem for those who are trying to get their foot in the door, who are trying to make this into a career, leave those in the comments down below and I will address as many of them as I can. If I find a particularly good one, it might make its way into its own video, because sometimes it takes more than a couple of sentences to really debunk some of the beliefs that we all have. But as always, like, share, subscribe, hit the bell, do all of those things to keep this channel going, keep this show running. And until next time, this is your Tabletop Mercenary, signing off. First and foremost, thank you for staying to the end of this episode of Tabletop Mercenary. If there's a question you have about being an RPG creator, please don't hesitate to put it in the comments below so I can address it in a future episode. If you want to help me keep the lights on and keep this show going, then please consider subscribing to the channel, liking the video, and giving it a share on your own social media pages to help boost the signal. Lastly, If you really enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving a tip by buying me a Ko-fi or becoming a Patreon patron at the links in the video description below. You'll find me on both sites under the name The Literary Mercenary.